On the day I was supposed to start my new life at college, my family turned it into a nightmare, but they underestimated just how much I learned working in their business and how far I'd go to take back what was mine. I should have known something was wrong when my aunt kept avoiding eye contact during the drive to the bank. I should have trusted my gut when my uncle's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. But I was 19, excited about finally escaping to Boston University, and foolishly believed that family meant protection, not betrayal. By 4:30 that afternoon, I'd discovered that my college fund, my parents' final gift to me, had vanished into my guardian's pockets, leaving me stranded with nothing but a dorm room key and a burning desire for justice. My name is Kayla Brooks, and I learned about loss before I learned about multiplication tables. I was 9 years old when the Michigan State police officer knocked on our front door that rainy October evening. I remember hiding behind the couch, clutching my stuffed elephant, while my babysitter, Mrs. Henderson, spoke in hushed tones by the doorway. The words, head-on collision and died instantly, floated through the air like poison. But my 9-year-old brain couldn't quite piece them together into the reality that would reshape my entire existence. My parents, David and Sarah Brooks, had been driving home from their anniversary dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light on Highway 23. They never made it past the intersection near Miller's Creek Bridge, the same bridge I'd crossed hundreds of times on family trips to the lake, the same bridge where Dad always honked the horn twice just to hear the echo bounce off the water below. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and casseroles, of strangers who claimed to know my parents, of relatives I'd only seen in Christmas cards suddenly materializing in our living room. But through it all, Aunt Mary Ann was there, my father's younger sister, who smelled like vanilla perfume and spoke in the same gentle cadence as Dad. She held my hand during the service, whispered reassurances when I couldn't stop crying, and promised that everything would be okay. Uncle Peter, Mary Ann's husband of 15 years, was quieter but equally comforting. He was a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands who worked in construction, and he had this way of fixing broken things that made me believe he could fix the gaping hole in my world too. When he offered to carry my suitcase up to their guest bedroom in their modest 2-story house in Millbrook, Michigan, I felt something close to relief for the first time in weeks. Those early years with Mary Ann and Peter were the closest thing to healing I thought possible. They kept my parents' photos displayed prominently on the mantelpiece, right next to their own family pictures. Mary Ann would brush my hair the same way Mom used to, starting at the ends and working her way up to avoid tangles. Peter taught me how to change a tire and use a socket wrench, skills Dad had promised to show me when I got older. They talked about my parents often, sharing stories I'd never heard, like how Dad once tried to impress Mom by cooking dinner for her parents and nearly burned down his apartment, or how Mom had been so nervous on their first date that she accidentally ordered dessert for her main course. These glimpses into their lives before I existed made them feel real again, not just memories fading at the edges. But it was the grown-up conversations I overheard that truly captured my attention. Late at night, when they thought I was asleep, I'd creep to the top of the stairs and listen to Mary Ann and Peter discussing the insurance money and trust funds and making sure it all goes to her education. The numbers they whispered seemed impossibly large to my young mind, enough money to send me to any college I wanted, they said, with plenty left over for graduate school if I chose that path. David and Sarah were so smart about this, Mary Ann had murmured one evening, her voice carrying up the stairwell. The life insurance policy, the trust they made sure she'd never have to worry about her future, even without them. Peter's response was muffled, but I caught fragments. Sacred responsibility, and what they would have wanted, and college fund stays untouched until she's ready. At 9, then 10, then 11 years old, I found strange comfort in knowing my parents had somehow reached beyond death to protect me. They'd planned for a future they wouldn't see, ensuring that their daughter me would have every opportunity they'd dreamed of giving me. The money felt like love made tangible, a final embrace that would carry me through to adulthood. Those were the good years, when grief was sharp but hope remained intact, when Marianne still called me sweetheart the way Mom used to, and when Peter still spoke of my parents as if they might walk through the door any moment to reclaim their daughter and their carefully laid plans. I had no way of knowing that those same carefully laid plans would eventually become the weapon my guardians would use against me, or that the love my parents had tried to preserve would become the very thing that nearly destroyed my future. But at 11 years old, safely tucked into the guest bedroom that had slowly become mine, surrounded by the remnants of my old life and the promise of security, I still believed that family meant protection. I still believed that some things were sacred. The shift happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first, like a photograph slowly fading in sunlight. The memories of my parents began disappearing from daily conversation, replaced by something else entirely, the family business. Brooks & Co. Home renovations had started as Peter's small contracting operation, but by the time I turned 14, it had expanded into something more ambitious. What began as weekend bathroom remodels and kitchen updates had grown into full-scale home renovations, complete with a showroom storefront on Main Street and 3 full-time employees. The family photos on the mantelpiece gradually found themselves pushed aside to make room for industry awards and before and after project photos. "Business is booming, honey," Marianne would say whenever I asked about college planning or my trust fund. "Uncle Peter's really making something of himself. We're so proud." The conversations about my parents' careful financial planning became less frequent, then sporadic, then non-existent. Instead, dinner table talk revolved around profit margins, supply chain issues, and expansion opportunities. When I'd try to steer the conversation back to my future or ask direct questions about my college fund, I'd get vague reassurances and quick subject changes. "Don't worry about money right now, sweetheart," Marianne would say, though she'd stopped calling me sweetheart as often. "Focus on your grades. We're handling all the financial stuff." But handling the financial stuff apparently meant I needed to start contributing to the family operation. It began innocently enough. Could I help answer phones at the showroom after school? Just for a few hours, just until they could hire proper office staff. Could I help organize receipts and invoices? It was good experience, they said. I'd learn valuable business skills. By 15, my after-school routine had transformed entirely. Instead of homework and extracurricular activities, I found myself at Brooks & Co. every weekday from 3:30 until 7, and most Saturdays from 9 until 5. I answered phones, filed paperwork, updated customer databases, and even helped design simple renovation layouts on the computer software Peter had invested in. "This is all going toward your future," Peter would remind me when I complained about missing study group sessions or friend hangouts. "You're learning the business from the ground up. Plus, we're saving every penny we would have paid someone else to do this work. It's all going into the pot for your education." Except I never saw a paycheck, not even a small one. "Oh, we're keeping track of your hours," Marianne assured me whenever I brought it up. "But it's more efficient to just add it directly to your college savings. That way, you're not losing money to taxes, and it's earning interest with the rest of your fund." The explanation sounded reasonable enough, especially coming from adults who had taken care of me for 6 years, but something about the way Peter's eyes shifted when he talked about the pot made my stomach twist with unease, and Marianne had developed this habit of changing the subject immediately after any mention of my trust fund, as if the words themselves were somehow dangerous. The whispered late-night conversations continued, but their tone had changed. Gone were the reverent discussions about my parents' wisdom and foresight. Now I caught fragments about cash flow problems and temporary solutions and investment opportunities. When I strained to hear more, creeping down the hallway on sock-covered feet, the words that drifted up from the kitchen made my blood run cold. "It's just sitting there doing nothing." Peter's voice carried more clearly than usual one night in February. "The girl won't need it for 3 more years. We could solve the equipment financing issue and have it back before she even knows it's gone." "I don't know. Peter." Marianne's voice was uncertain, worried. "David and Sarah trusted us too." "David and Sarah aren't here." Peter interrupted, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard it. "And if this business goes under, what good is that money going to do her? We're talking about securing her future, not stealing from it." I pressed myself against the wall at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they'd hear it. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours before Marianne spoke again. "Just temporarily," she said finally, "and only what we absolutely need. The rest stays untouched." "Of course," Peter agreed quickly. "Just enough to get us through this rough patch. She'll never even know." But I did know, and as I crept back to my bedroom that night, a sick certainty settled in my stomach like a stone. The money my parents had died believing would protect me, the money that had comforted me through 7 years of grief and uncertainty, was being treated like a business loan by the people who were supposed to guard it. Over the following months, I watched for signs, paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. New appliances appeared in the kitchen. Peter started driving a newer truck. Marianne began wearing jewelry I'd never seen before. When I asked about these improvements, I was told they were business expenses or necessary investments. The most telling change, though, was in how they talked about my future. College had always been discussed as an inevitability, a given that required only the selection of the right school. Now, suddenly, they were suggesting I might want to consider community college first, or maybe take a gap year to really think about what I wanted to do. "Education is important," Peter would say, "but practical experience is worth just as much. Look how much you've learned working with us." By my junior year of high school, I realized with crystalline clarity that my guardians were no longer preserving my inheritance. They were spending it. The sacred trust my parents had established was being systematically dismantled, one temporary loan and business investment at a time. And I was expected to smile and be grateful for the privilege of working for free in the business that was consuming my future. The realization that my college fund was being pillaged lit a fire under me that burned brighter than any teenage rebellion. If Marianne and Peter thought I'd quietly accept their suggestion of community college and gap years, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I threw myself into academics with the intensity that surprised even my teachers. My junior year GPA shot from a respectable 3.6 to a perfect 4.0. I joined the debate team, became editor of the school newspaper, and volunteered at the local literacy center every weekend. When other kids were at parties or sleeping in on Saturday mornings, I was crafting essays for scholarship applications or studying for AP exams. I had one goal: get into a good university with enough financial aid that I wouldn't need to rely entirely on my trust fund, the trust fund that might not even exist anymore. You're pushing yourself awfully hard, honey," Marianne observed one evening as I hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table, working on my 4th scholarship essay of the week. "Maybe you should slow down a little. Enjoy being a teenager." I looked up from my screen, where I was writing about overcoming adversity and the importance of self-reliance themes that had become all too relevant to my life. "I want to be prepared for college applications," I said simply. "Well, that's still 2 years away," she replied, but something in her voice suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with my newfound academic fervor. "There's plenty of time to figure things out. Plenty of time for them to drain the rest of my inheritance. More likely." By senior year, my strategy was paying off. I'd been accepted to 7 universities, including Boston University, my dream school. BU offered me a partial academic scholarship, not enough to cover everything, but substantial enough that I'd only need about $30,000 from my trust fund for the first year. It seemed reasonable, manageable, and most importantly, it would get me out of Millbrook and away from the increasingly uncomfortable dynamic at home. The day I received my acceptance letter from Boston University was one of the most bittersweet moments of my life. I sat in my car in the school parking lot, holding the envelope with shaking hands, thinking about how proud my parents would have been. Dad had always talked about wanting me to experience a real college town, and Mom had dreamed of me studying literature or journalism. BU offered both a vibrant campus in the heart of Boston and one of the best communications programs in the country. When I walked into the house that afternoon, practically glowing with excitement, I expected at least some enthusiasm from Marianne and Peter. Instead, I was met with forced smiles and lukewarm congratulations. Boston is so far away," was Marianne's first comment after I showed her the acceptance letter. "And so expensive. Are you sure you've thought this through?" "It's only 5 hours by car," I said, my excitement dimming slightly. "And I got a partial scholarship. Plus, I have my trust fund, right. That's what it's for." The look that passed between Marianne and Peter didn't escape my notice. It was the same look they'd been exchanging whenever money came up for the past 2 years, a mixture of guilt and panic that made my stomach churn. "Of course, sweetheart," Peter said, but his voice lacked conviction. We'll figure it all out when the time comes. There's still a few months to plan." A few months. The same phrase they'd been using for years whenever I brought up anything related to my college expenses. Always just a little more time needed to sort things out or optimize the investments. As graduation approached, my questions about the logistics became more specific and urgent. When would we meet with the bank? Which account would the tuition payment come from? Did I need to be present to authorize the transfer? Each inquiry was met with increasingly vague responses and promises that everything would be handled soon. The breaking point came 3 weeks before I was supposed to leave for Boston. I'd been trying to register for orientation events and needed to submit my enrollment deposit, a relatively small amount of $1,500 that would secure my spot in the freshman class. "Can we take care of the deposit this week?" I asked over dinner one evening in late July. "The deadline is Friday, and I want to make sure I get into the dorm I requested." Peter set down his fork with deliberate precision. "Actually, we need to talk about that." My blood ran cold. "Talk about what?" "The timing might be a little tight," Marianne interjected quickly. "There have been some complications with accessing the trust fund, legal paperwork, bank procedures. You know how these things go." "What kind of complications?" I pressed, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Nothing serious," Peter assured me, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just some administrative delays. We might need to postpone your start date by a semester, just to give us time to sort everything out properly." The room seemed to tilt sideways. "Postpone, Peter. I've already been accepted. I've already chosen my classes. My roommate is expecting me." "These things happen, honey," Marianne said softly. "A gap semester might be good for you anyway. You could work more hours at the business, save up some additional money." "I don't want to work more hours at the business." The words exploded out of me before I could stop them. "I want to go to college. That's what my parents saved for. That's what the money is supposed to be for." The silence that followed was deafening. Peter's jaw tightened, and Marianne looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "Your parents left you well provided for," Peter said finally, his voice taking on a stern tone I'd never heard before. "But that doesn't mean the money is available to be thrown around carelessly. We have a responsibility to manage your inheritance wisely." "Thrown around carelessly," I repeated, my voice rising. "It's tuition. It's literally what the fund was created for." "Don't raise your voice at us," Marianne said sharply. "We've been taking care of you for 10 years. We know what's best." But looking at their faces guilty, defensive, and avoiding direct eye contact, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever they thought was best had nothing to do with my education and everything to do with covering their tracks. The trust fund my parents had died believing would secure my future was gone, wasn't it? Or at least, most of it was. And they were hoping I'd be too grateful, too compliant, too afraid of being abandoned again to fight back. They were about to learn just how wrong they were about that, too. The morning of August 15th, my planned move-in day arrived with the kind of crisp, hopeful weather that should have marked the beginning of everything I'd worked for. Instead, it felt like a funeral march as I sat in the passenger seat of Peter's truck, watching familiar Michigan farmland blur past the window. We'd been driving in tense silence for 20 minutes when Peter finally cleared his throat. "Kayla, we need to stop at the bank before we head to Boston." My stomach dropped, though I'd been expecting this moment for weeks. "The bank. Just to take care of some paperwork," he said, but his hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Get everything sorted out for your tuition payment." I stared at his profile, noting the nervous twitch in his jaw, the way he kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if someone might be following us. Everything about his body language screamed guilt and panic. "Okay," I said quietly, though my heart was hammering against my rib cage. Millbrook First National Bank sat on the corner of Main and Oak, a squat brick building that had anchored the town's small downtown district for over 40 years. I'd been inside dozens of times as a child with my parents, and later with Marianne and Peter for various routine transactions. But walking through those glass doors that morning felt like entering a courtroom where my entire future would be decided. The bank manager, Mrs. Patterson, greeted us with professional warmth, though I caught her shooting a curious glance between Peter and me. We were led to a small conference room with a fake wood table and uncomfortable chairs that squeaked every time someone shifted position. "Now then," Mrs. Patterson said, spreading several folders across the table. "You wanted to discuss the Brooks Trust account." "That's right," Peter said, his voice artificially casual. "We need to access some funds for Kayla's college expenses." Mrs. Patterson nodded and opened one of the folders. "I have the account details here. However, I should mention that there have been some irregularities in the account activity over the past few years that we've been meaning to discuss." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Peter's forced smile faltered. "Irregularities?" "Well, the trust was originally established with specific educational stipulations," Mrs. Patterson explained, consulting her papers. "But there have been numerous withdrawals over the past 3 years that weren't designated for educational purposes. The current balance is significantly lower than what was projected for this date." My mouth went dry. "How much lower?" Mrs. Patterson hesitated, glancing at Peter as if seeking permission to continue. When he said nothing, she turned back to me. "The original trust fund was established with approximately $250,000. Based on conservative investment growth, it should have reached roughly $300,000 by now. However, the current balance is—" She paused, consulting her computer screen. "Approximately $47,000. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face as the math sank in. $200,000 gone. My parents' entire life insurance payout, their final gift to me, reduced to less than a fifth of its original value. "How?" I whispered. Peter finally spoke, but he wasn't looking at me. "There were business opportunities," he said quietly. "Investments that would have grown the fund substantially. They just didn't work out the way we expected." "Business opportunities," I repeated, my voice starting to shake. "You invested my college fund in your business." "Not invested," he said quickly. "Borrowed, temporarily. We always intended to pay it back with interest before you needed it." Mrs. Patterson was studying the account history with obvious concern. "Mr. Brooks, I'm seeing multiple withdrawals of $20, $30, even $50,000 at a time. These weren't small, temporary loans." The room was spinning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what I was hearing. 3 years of systematically draining my inheritance. 3 years of lies and reassurances while they spent my future on equipment and trucks and God knows what else. "We can still make this work," Peter was saying, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "The business is doing well now. We can set up a payment plan, get you the tuition money over the next few months." The next few months, I found my voice, and it came out stronger than I felt. "Peter, I'm supposed to move into my dorm today. Classes start in 2 weeks. "Maybe you could defer for a semester," he suggested weakly. "Just until we can—" "No." The word came out like a gunshot. "No, I'm not deferring. I'm not taking a gap year. I'm not putting my life on hold so you can figure out how to pay back the money you stole from me." "Kayla, please don't use that word. Well, what word stole I was standing now, though I didn't remember getting up? What would you call it, Peter? Because Mrs. Patterson just told us that you took $200,000 from a trust fund that wasn't yours to touch. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should discuss the available options. With the remaining balance, we could cover one semester's expenses, and then what? I turned to face Peter fully. Then I'm supposed to trust that you'll magically find the money for the remaining 7 semesters, the same way you were going to have everything sorted out by today. Peter's face had gone red, whether from shame or anger. I couldn't tell. We've been taking care of you for 10 years, Kayla. We've fed you, housed you, clothed you. With my parents' money. The words exploded out of me. You've been taking care of me with my own inheritance, and now you're acting like I should be grateful that there's anything left at all. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mrs. Patterson quietly gathering her papers. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. I think, she said carefully, that you folks might want to continue this discussion at home. In the meantime, I can prepare the paperwork for a partial withdrawal to cover immediate expenses. But I was already walking toward the door. I couldn't stay in that suffocating room another second. Couldn't listen to Peter's excuses and justifications. Couldn't pretend that this was anything other than the complete destruction of everything my parents had tried to give me. Kayla, wait! Peter called after me, but I was already pushing through the bank's front doors and onto the sidewalk. Standing on the corner of Main and Oak, with my entire future crumbling around me, I felt more alone than I had since the night my parents died. But underneath the devastation and betrayal, something else was growing, a cold, clear anger that sharpened my thoughts and steadied my hands. They thought they'd broken me. They thought I'd accept whatever scraps they were willing to offer and be grateful for it. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. The drive to Boston University took place in complete silence. Peter had eventually coaxed me back into the truck with promises that we'd figure something out. But I wasn't speaking to him. I stared out the passenger window, watching mile markers tick by while my mind raced through possibilities and calculations. $47,000. It was enough for 1 year, maybe 2 if I lived like a monk and worked every available hour. But it wasn't the future my parents had envisioned for me. It wasn't the security they'd died believing they'd provided. When we reached the campus, I went through the motions of move-in day like an automaton. I signed paperwork, collected my dorm key, and hauled boxes up 3 flights of stairs to my tiny room in Warren Towers. Peter tried to make conversation, pointing out campus landmarks and suggesting we grab lunch before he drove back to Michigan, but I responded in monosyllables. By 4:30 that afternoon, he was loading his empty truck and preparing to leave. Kayla, he said, standing awkwardly by the driver's door, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but we're still family. We'll make this right. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had held my hand at my parents' funeral, who had taught me to change oil and balance a checkbook, who had just destroyed my future for the sake of his business. No, I said quietly. We won't, because family doesn't steal from each other. He drove away without another word, and I watched his truck disappear around the corner with a mixture of relief and terror. For the first time in 10 years, I was truly on my own. The next few days passed in a haze of orientation activities and freshman bonding exercises. I smiled when expected, participated in icebreakers, and made polite conversation with my roommate Jessica, a bubbly girl from Connecticut whose biggest worry seemed to be whether her boyfriend back home would stay faithful. I envied her innocent concerns. But it was during a late-night study session in the computer lab that my real plan began to take shape. I'd been researching financial aid options and work-study programs when a random thought struck me. I still had access to the Brooks & Co.'s accounting system. 3 summers of data entry and bookkeeping had earned me login credentials to the company's QuickBooks account. Peter had never bothered to revoke my access, probably because he'd never imagined I'd have reason to use it from 500 miles away. My hands trembled slightly as I navigated to the familiar login page at 2:15 in the morning. The computer lab was empty except for one other student working on a programming assignment, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. Username K. Brooks, password Brooks 2019. The system accepted my credentials without hesitation, and suddenly I was looking at 3 years' worth of financial records for my guardian's business. What I found there made my stomach turn. The business opportunities Peter had mentioned weren't investments at all. They were purchases. A brand new Ford F-350 truck, $68,000. A company retreat cabin on Lake Huron, $95,000. Industrial equipment that seemed suspiciously overpriced. Restaurant bills categorized as client meetings. And a paper trail of personal expenses disguised as business deductions. But the most damning evidence was in the memo field of the withdrawals from my trust account. Peter hadn't even bothered to disguise them properly. Equipment financing, property acquisition, operational expansion. Each withdrawal corresponded exactly to a major purchase for the business or their personal use. They hadn't borrowed from my trust fund, they'd looted it systematically, treating my inheritance like their personal ATM while feeding me lies about careful investment and temporary loans. I spent the next hour screenshotting everything, creating a digital paper trail that told the complete story of my money's disappearance. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't financial mismanagement or even well-intentioned mistakes. This was deliberate theft, carried out over years while they looked me in the eye and promised my future was secure. But as devastating as the evidence was, it also gave me something I hadn't had before: hope. Because buried in those financial records was information that Peter and Marianne probably didn't realize I possessed. Brooks & Co. wasn't just successful, it was thriving. The business account showed healthy cash flow, substantial profit margins, and a balance that would easily cover what they'd stolen from me. More importantly, the company maintained its primary checking account at the same bank where my trust fund was housed, Millbrook First National. Even more interesting was the signature authorization on that business account. Due to some paperwork quirk from when I'd started working there as a 15-year-old, I was still listed as an authorized signatory. Peter had added me to give me the ability to make small deposits and handle routine transactions, but he'd never bothered to remove my access. I stared at the computer screen for a long time, my mind racing through possibilities. The student working on his programming assignment packed up and left, leaving me alone with the humming fluorescent lights and a plan that was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. They'd taken my money using their legal authority as my guardians. They'd violated the trust my parents had placed in them and destroyed the security that was supposed to carry me through college. But they'd also made a critical mistake. They'd underestimated exactly how much I'd learned during those 3 years of unpaid labor in their business. I knew their account numbers, I knew their banking procedures, I knew their security protocols, and most importantly, I knew exactly how much money they owed me. As I logged out of the accounting system and gathered my notes, a cold certainty settled in my chest. Peter had been right about one thing: I had learned the business from the ground up, but I'd learned far more than he'd intended to teach me. And I was about to put that education to very good use. The war they'd started when they froze my college fund was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, the next morning. I walked into Boston University's Student Legal Services office with a manila folder full of printouts and a determination that surprised even me. The office was tucked away on the second floor of the Student Activities Building, behind a door marked with small lettering that most students probably walked past without noticing. Sarah Chen, the paralegal who greeted me, was a graduate student with kind eyes and an immediately reassuring presence. She listened without interruption as I laid out my situation, spreading bank statements, trust fund documents, and screenshots of the business accounting records across her desk like pieces of a puzzle. "This is definitely a breach of fiduciary duty," she said after reviewing everything for 20 minutes. "Your guardians had a legal obligation to preserve your trust fund for its intended purpose. Using it for business expenses and personal purchases is a clear violation." "But what can I actually do about it?" I asked. They're 500 miles away, and they control everything. Sarah pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. Well, you have several options. We could help you file a formal complaint with the probate court in Michigan. We could also assist with a civil lawsuit for breach of trust and conversion of assets. My heart sank. How long would that take? Realistically, 18 months to 2 years, maybe longer if they fight it. She saw my expression and continued gently. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Legal remedies take time, especially when you're dealing with cross-state jurisdiction issues. 2 years? By then, I'd either be buried in student loans or forced to drop out entirely. The legal system, however just in theory, wasn't going to save my immediate future. Is there anything else I can do? I pressed. Any other options? Sarah hesitated, glancing around the small office before leaning forward slightly. Unofficially, if you have documented proof that they used your money for unauthorized purposes, and if that money is still accessible through legitimate channels. She paused meaningfully. Well, recovering your own stolen property isn't technically theft. The words hung in the air between us. She wasn't explicitly telling me to take back my money, but she wasn't telling me not to, either. Hypothetically, I said carefully, if someone had authorized access to an account containing their own stolen funds, and they transferred only the exact amount that was taken from them, hypothetically, Sarah replied, that someone would want to be very careful about documentation, precise records of what was taken, when it was taken, and exactly how much they were recovering, and they'd want to be prepared to justify their actions if questioned. I spent the next 3 hours in the law library, researching trust law, fiduciary duty, and the legal concept of self-help remedies. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. Under certain circumstances, victims of financial abuse could indeed recover their own property without going through lengthy court proceedings, but only if they could prove beyond doubt that the money was rightfully theirs and that legal remedies were inadequate. More importantly, I discovered that as long as I only took back what was provably mine, and as long as I had legitimate access to the account, my actions would likely be viewed as recovery rather than theft. The key was having ironclad documentation and staying within precisely defined boundaries. That evening, I sat in my dorm room with my laptop, creating a meticulous spreadsheet that would become my roadmap to justice. I went through every withdrawal from my trust fund, matching each one to corresponding purchases in the Brooks & Code records. The cabin on Lake Huron, $95,000, withdrawn on March 15, 2023. The new truck, $68,000, withdrawn on June 3, 2023. Kitchen renovation for their personal home, $37,000, withdrawn on September 10, 2023. By midnight, I had compiled an exact accounting of $203,000 that had been stolen from my trust fund and used for their personal benefit. The remaining $47,000 in my account meant they owed me $156,000 money that was currently sitting in the Brooks & Co. business account, earning them interest while I scrambled to figure out how to pay for my education. The next step was the hardest, actually planning how to recover it. I knew from years of handling their banking that large transfers required either dual authorization or an in-person visit to the bank, but I also knew that my signatory status on their business account gave me legitimate access, and that transfers under $50,000 could be authorized with a single signature. My plan began to crystallize. Multiple smaller transfers over several days, each one precisely documented and justified by corresponding withdrawals from my trust fund. Nothing excessive, nothing that wasn't provably mine, but enough to recover what my parents had intended for my education. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about money, it was about justice. Peter and Marianne had counted on my compliance, my gratitude, my fear of being abandoned again. They'd assumed I'd accept whatever scraps they offered and never fight back. But they'd forgotten something crucial they'd trained me themselves. 3 years of working in their business had taught me their systems, their procedures, their vulnerabilities. They'd given me the tools to discover their theft, and now those same tools would allow me to recover what they'd stolen. On Thursday morning, I called Millbrook First National and confirmed that my authorization on the Brooks & Co.'s account was still active. The customer service representative cheerfully verified my identity and access privileges, apparently unaware that she was helping me prepare to reclaim my own stolen inheritance. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Miss Brooks?" she asked. "Actually, yes," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I'll be coming in tomorrow to handle some business transfers. Could you tell me what documentation I'll need for multiple transactions?" By Thursday evening, I had everything I needed: complete documentation of the theft, legal justification for my actions, and a precise plan for recovering exactly what was mine. The only thing left was to decide whether I had the courage to actually go through with it. As I sat in my dorm room that night, looking out at the Boston skyline and thinking about my parents' dreams for my future, the answer became crystal clear. They'd stolen my inheritance, but they'd also made a fatal mistake they'd taught me how to take it back. The Greyhound bus from Boston to Millbrook took 7 hours and cost me $63 I could barely afford. I spent the entire ride reviewing my documentation and rehearsing exactly what I would say if anyone questioned my actions. By the time we pulled into the small station on Friday morning at 9:45, my hands were steady and my resolve was absolute. I'd told my roommate Jessica I was visiting a sick relative, not entirely a lie, considering my relationship with Marianne and Peter was definitely terminal. I'd dressed professionally in dark slacks and a blazer, wanting to look like someone conducting legitimate business rather than a desperate college freshman about to commit what some might consider financial warfare. Millbrook First National opened its doors at 10 sharp, and I was the second customer through the entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice remained calm as I approached the teller window. "Good morning," I said to Mrs. Rodriguez, whom I'd known since childhood. "I need to make several transfers from the Brooks & Company business account." She smiled warmly. "Of course, dear. Do you have the transfer authorization forms?" I'd downloaded and filled out the paperwork the night before, calculating each transfer down to the penny. 5 separate transactions, each under $40,000 to avoid triggering additional approval requirements. The total $156,000, exactly what they owed me. "I'll need to verify the account balance first," Mrs. Rodriguez said, typing on her computer. Her eyebrows rose slightly. "My goodness, business must be doing well. There's definitely sufficient funds for these transfers." More than sufficient. The business account showed a balance of over $200,000 money that should have been mine all along, plus whatever legitimate profits they'd managed to earn. "The receiving account?" she asked. I slid across the paperwork for a new checking account I'd opened at a different bank in Boston the day before. Clean, separate, and completely under my control. "This might take a few minutes to process," Mrs. Rodriguez said, beginning to input the transfers. 5 separate transactions is a bit unusual." "I'm diversifying some investments," I replied smoothly. "Spreading things out for tax purposes." It was a lie, but it sounded plausible enough. She nodded and continued working, occasionally asking me to verify account numbers or confirm transfer amounts. By 10:30, it was done. $156,000 had moved from Brooks & Co.'s business account to my personal account in Boston. Mrs. Rodriguez handed me the transaction receipts with a smile. "All set," she said cheerfully. "Is there anything else you need today?" "Actually, yes." I pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared the night before. "Could you make sure Mr. Peter Brooks receives this when he comes in? It's some important business documentation." "Of course, dear." The envelope contained copies of every piece of evidence I'd gathered: the trust fund withdrawal records, the corresponding business purchases, the legal research on fiduciary duty, and a detailed breakdown of exactly how much money they'd stolen and exactly how much I'd recovered. But most importantly, it contained a letter I'd spent hours crafting. "Peter and Marianne. By the time you read this, I will have transferred $156,000 from the Brooks & Co. business account. This represents the exact amount you illegally withdrew from my trust fund over the past 3 years. I have complete documentation proving that every dollar I've recovered was stolen from my inheritance and used for your personal benefit. The cabin, the truck, the renovations, the equipment purchases all paid for with money my parents died believing would secure my education. I am not a thief. I am simply taking back what was always mine. You have two choices: accept that I have recovered my stolen inheritance and continue with your lives, or try to challenge my actions and face the legal consequences of your theft. I have copies of all financial records, witness testimony from Mrs. Patterson at the bank, and legal consultation confirming that your actions constitute breach of fiduciary duty and conversion of assets. If you choose to fight this, I will file formal charges and ensure that every business partner, client, and community member in Millbrook knows exactly what you did to an orphaned girl who trusted you. If you choose to accept it, we can part ways quietly and never speak of this again. The choice is yours. Kayla. P.S. I've also sent courtesy notices to your 3 largest business clients, informing them that there may be some temporary disruptions to your operations due to a family matter requiring immediate attention. I thought they deserved advance warning in case your cash flow becomes complicated. That last part was calculated cruelty, but I felt no guilt about it. They'd threatened my future. Now I was threatening theirs. Fair was fair. I walked out of Millbrook First National at 11:15, feeling lighter than I had in months. The autumn air was crisp and clean, and for the first time since that devastating day in the bank, I could breathe freely. My phone started ringing 20 minutes later. Just as I was boarding the return bus to Boston, Peter's name flashed on the screen, and I let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, then again. By the time the bus pulled out of Millbrook, I had 7 missed calls and 3 voicemails I had no intention of listening to. Instead, I turned off my phone and settled back in my seat, watching the small town that had been my prison for 10 years disappear in the distance. In my purse was a receipt showing that my college education was now fully funded. My parents' dreams for my future finally secured. They'd counted on my gratitude, my compliance, my fear of abandonment. They'd assumed I'd accept whatever they chose to give me and never fight back. But they'd forgotten the most important lesson of all: never underestimate what a desperate person will do to survive. And never, ever, steal from someone who knows all your secrets. The war was over. I'd won. I made it back to my dorm by 8:30 that evening, exhausted but victorious. My phone had accumulated 23 missed calls and 14 voicemails, a symphony of rage, desperation, and threats that I had no interest in hearing. I powered it off and shoved it in my desk drawer, choosing instead to focus on the financial aid forms I needed to complete now that my college funding was secure. But Peter wasn't going to let me disappear that easily. I was studying in the common room on Sunday evening when someone knocked on my dorm building's front door. Through the glass, I could see a familiar figure pacing back and forth on the sidewalk's stocky build, graying hair, and the kind of agitated energy that comes from a 10-hour drive fueled by pure fury. Peter had come to Boston. My stomach dropped, but I wasn't surprised. I'd known this confrontation was inevitable. The only question was whether he'd come to negotiate or to threaten. I met him outside the building, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of entering my space. He looked terrible unshaven, exhausted, wearing the same clothes he'd probably thrown on when he first discovered what I'd done. Kayla. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. We need to talk. I don't think we do, I replied calmly. Everything I needed to say was in my letter. You can't just steal money and think there won't be consequences, he said, his voice rising. That's our business account. That's our livelihood. My money, I corrected. Money you stole from my trust fund. Money my parents died believing would pay for my education. We were going to pay it back. When the word came out like a whip crack. After I dropped out of college, after I spent the next 10 years working for free in your business while you made excuses. Peter's face flushed red. We raised you. We fed you, housed you, clothed you for 10 years. That money we spent, it wasn't theft, it was reimbursement for a decade of expenses. The audacity of it took my breath away. Reimbursement, Peter. You were paid by the state to be my guardians. You received monthly checks for my care. And even if you hadn't, that doesn't give you the right to steal my inheritance. I'm not going to let you destroy everything we've built, he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. Give us back that money, or I'll have you arrested for theft. I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had once felt like a father figure, who had taught me to drive and helped me with homework, who was now threatening to have me thrown in jail for recovering my own stolen property. Go ahead, I said quietly. Call the police. Tell them how your 19-year-old ward discovered you'd stolen her entire inheritance and had the audacity to take it back. Explain to them how you used a dead couple's life insurance money to buy yourself a truck and a vacation cabin. Peter's bluster faltered slightly. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. I pulled out my phone and held it up. I've got Mrs. Patterson from the bank on speed dial. She'd be happy to explain to the authorities how you systematically drained a trust fund that was supposed to be untouchable. I've also got Sarah from Student Legal Services, who's already prepared to testify about fiduciary duty and conversion of assets. His face went pale. You wouldn't. Try me. My voice was steel. I've got nothing left to lose. Peter, you already destroyed my relationship with the only family I had left. You think I'm afraid of a legal fight. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the distant sounds of campus life students laughing, music playing from dorm windows, the normal sounds of young people living their lives without having to fight their own families for basic survival. Finally, Peter's shoulders sagged. What do you want? I want you to leave, I said simply. I want you to go back to Millbrook. Tell Marianne that the money is gone and it's not coming back, and rebuild your business with what you have left. I want you to never contact me again. And if we agree to that, then this stays between us. Your business partners don't need to know why you suddenly have cash flow problems. The community doesn't need to know what you did to me. You get to keep your reputation intact. Peter stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating the odds, weighing his options. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Sign this, he said. It's an agreement that you won't pursue any further legal action against us, and that you acknowledge the money you took covers any outstanding debts between us. I read through the document carefully. It was essentially a mutual non-disclosure agreement they wouldn't challenge my recovery of the money, and I wouldn't press criminal charges or sue them for additional damages. Fine, I said, taking the pen he offered, but I'm adding one clause. I wrote in the margin, Peter and Marianne Brooks acknowledge that all funds recovered by Kayla Brooks on October 15, 2024, represented stolen assets from her trust fund and that she was legally entitled to recover said funds. Peter read my addition and winced, but he signed the paper without argument. For what it's worth, he said quietly as he folded the agreement. We never meant for things to go this far. We really did plan to pay it back. The road to hell, I replied, is paved with good intentions. He walked away without another word, climbing into his truck and driving out of my life forever. I watched his taillights disappear into the Boston traffic, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Standing there on the sidewalk outside my dorm, I thought about my parents and wondered what they would think of how their careful plans had unfolded. They'd tried to protect me from exactly this kind of situation, but in the end, their protection had become the weapon used against me. But it had also become my salvation. Their money, my money, would see me through 4 years of college and into whatever future I chose to build. And I'd learned something valuable about myself in the process. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resourceful than anyone had given me credit for, and absolutely unwilling to be anyone's victim. The trust fund was secure, my education was guaranteed, and I was finally, truly free. Thank you so much for listening to this story of betrayal, determination, and justice served cold. I'd love to know where you're hearing this from. Are you listening during your commute? while working out, or maybe late at night like I used to when I couldn't sleep. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts on Kayla's story. Would you have had the courage to do what she did?